I'm an Australian. I hope you can understand me. That's the main thing. I move around the world and give talks on the public health approach, and it varies from country to country how well people can absorb my accent. But generally in Ireland, I've had a pretty good trot. It's just the colloquialisms you've got to watch out for. And if I say something you don't understand, just raise your hand and I'll translate. I came into palliative care in the mid-90s in Australia. I took the chair of palliative care in Australia. We had 7 or 8 professors of palliative care at the time that I arrived, and I was appointed the first non-clinical chair. All the professors of palliative care up until then were doctors and nurses. And then I came to the UK, to England, in fact, 10 years after that. So I've been in this part of the world for about 10 years since then. So what I'd like to do is tell you how I found palliative care when I first came to it in Australia, nearly 20 years ago, and how I found English palliative care when I came 10 years ago. It's actually the same story. And you might then decide where you are in relation to this story. Basically, when I came into palliative care, and I had been researching dying, actually. That's my area. My special research area is the study of dying. And I had avoided palliative care most of my career. For one thing, they're not particularly interested in dying. And they're not interested in the social. Symptom management is the big thing in palliative care. Big on symptom management. Not much on dying people. And the social, well, not really. Not really. Even in the first hour here this morning, I was amused to find how often the word social had disappeared. How the words psychological, emotional, and spiritual are privileged. We did have a thing called psychosocial palliative care. Wonderful term. Problem with psychosocial is that it's consistently more psycho than social. So close, but no cigar. And then there's holistic palliative care. Fantastic, holistic palliative care. What this means is, if you believe palliative care is physical care, psychological care, social care, spiritual care, what you get is a professional thrown at you for every one of them. So you get a doctor, you get a nurse, you get a social worker, you get a chaplain, and you name the need, we'll find a professional, we'll go out in the streets and we'll get you one. We'll throw one of those at you. It's a bit like the old 70s joke about the eclectic psychologist. We know what is an eclectic psychologist? Someone who studies rats and pigeons. Not much diversity there. And the story is even worse. It gets worse. Because often the social workers that you get are not really the social workers. Often like to be counsellors. Some of it's not their fault. Sometimes that's how we employ them. So we don't know any other model. Don't want them to be social. Rather have them as counsellors. You get chaplains like that too. I once met a chaplain at a palliative care service in the north of Victoria. We were at a big hospice do, and he sidled over to me, and so I said to him, "What do you do?" And he said, "I'm the chaplain." But he said, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, "I'm really a counsellor." So this was Australia, of course, not Britain. So in Australia, we say what we think. So I said to them, why would we employ you? We already have a counsellor. In fact, we've got two. We've got a social worker who thinks she's a counsellor, and we've got the counsellor who thinks they're a counsellor. Now we've got you. We've got 3 counsellors. Death by counselling. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? So then we move in. So what, I said, do you bring that's unique to the table? What is it you bring? And there was no answer. And the saddest part of the story, it gets better, but let's just go for the dark side first. The sad side of the story is that not only has palliative care in Australia in 96 and Britain in 2006 not had any decent understanding of the word social, but they had a worse understanding of the word community. It appears that community is a place where you get the patients from. It's also where you can get volunteers. It's a place where you can raise funds, and it's a place where you can raise awareness. Love that raise awareness stuff. Let's not do anything. Let's not change behaviour. Let's raise awareness. So the problem with palliative care in those days is that when you pull in your volunteers, you give them a makeover. It's called a training course, and the training course puts them on a leash, and you're allowed to go in and read books and take out the garbage and walk the dog. You have to learn about safety and boundaries. Actually, you've got little professionals. And all of a sudden, that small glimmer of the community also joins the professionals. So what is the public health approach to palliative care, you might ask? Basically, it's to expand our approach to healthcare to include the community as genuine partners. Now, I'm going to say that again, because that's the main message today, ladies and gentlemen. The community as partners, equal partners, with their own authority, with their own practice wisdom, with their own problems, just like professionals. We're moving from a direct services, clinical, face-to-face, bedside, acute care or institutional approach, and it doesn't really matter which words you use because they all mean the same thing. They all mean the same thing. To a community health promotion partnership approach. Eileen's talk that we heard here this morning, her last example with her sister-in-law, the lady who lives in London, the artist. That's a good example, and the only example, of health promotion. That's what health promotion looks like. Eileen's an ordinary person. She's a friend, not a professional, friend. She's engaged in end-of-life care. She's not on anybody's leash. We want to see a few million more like Eileen. Why do we want to do this? Well, first of all, we'd like to enable the end-of-life care system to conform to the rest of the healthcare system. That would be nice. There are no cardiologists these days, certainly not in the UK or North America or Australia, believes that cardiology is the first and final word on heart health. They don't believe that. You understand the importance of diet, drug and alcohol intake, exercise. You're supposed to take care of yourselves, ladies and gentlemen. You're supposed to take care of yourselves. And then when things go wrong, you end up in the cardiologist room. But up to then, that's what you're supposed to do. Accident and emergency. Accident and emergency is not about safety. Wearing your seatbelt is about safety. You should wear your seatbelt, your bicycle helmet, your condom, not necessarily all together. Some people like to do that, and I respect that, but when those things fail you, you end up in casualty, and that's the way it should be. You're supposed to look after yourself. We don't need our doctors to tell us what to do. We tell each other. Community development, public education, health promotion, social support. After this conference is over, we can all go out together and I'll have dinner and I'll order battered fish and chips. And some people say, well, that's a good choice. Next night, we'll go out again. Same crowd. I'll order battered fish and chips. Somebody will say, oh, you like your fish and chips, Alan. Third night, we go out again. I ordered battered fish and chips. Dead silence. Fourth night, we go out. I ordered battered fish and chips. Now somebody is going to break. They're going to say, Alan, this will kill you. Choose the hamburger. It's not the doctors and the nurses who are telling me, even though some of you may be doctors and nurses. It's actually my friends and my colleagues, it's my workmates who are watching my health. Health is not just the health system responsibility anymore. We know that, right? When you get a job, there's health and safety regulations that protect you and promote your health. When you send your children to school, it's the same. School has a health responsibility. End-of-life care, and particularly palliative care, is one of the very last to understand that system-wide approach. Every other medical speciality, from mental health to sexual health to gerontology to cardiology, understands prevention, harm reduction, early intervention. We are the last kids on the block to take this message. And people think it's all about dying. Palliative care is all about dying. It's not all about dying. Dying is easy to do. It's easy to die. That's not the problem. The problem are the comorbidities. It's the loneliness. It's the social isolation. It's the stigma. It's the job loss. It's the social rejection. It's the sexual acting out. It's the suicide. It's the sudden death that occurs to people whilst they are living with a life-threatening illness or a life-limiting illness. And you know what? These comorbidities are associated with caregiving as well. And bereavement as well. And how long does bereavement last? Forever. So, what are our forever strategies? So we need a social framework, not a psychological, emotional, which is the other euphemism, spiritual. We got those. We need a social framework. We need to re-engage the community whilst recognising the limits to professional care and supervision. Healthcare budgets all over the world, except for America, which is an exception for the moment, their budgets are stagnant or going backwards. That's not going to change. Local authorities in the UK, their social care budgets have been slashed by up to 40%. We're caught between a rock and a hard place. You can have the grand designs, but you will not put a doctor or even a district nurse on every street corner. It's not going to happen. We don't have the money, and we're going to have less. You need to think outside a direct services model. You need to understand, and you need to remind others, that end-of-life care, like health, is everybody's responsibility, not just services. So we need to go beyond an illness-bound view of end-of-life care. We have to include older people, yes. We have to include the well and the ill. Yes, the well. I love service user groups, but they're not enough. I want a group that has representatives of the Chamber of Commerce and the local museum and the churches and temples and the schools. People who are absolutely in the peak of health. I want them there. I want them there. Prevention, harm reduction, early intervention. They will die. Better prepare them sooner rather than later. The service user groups, arguably, have had a good taste of it. It's the rest of us who haven't. We need to include the carers and family, but we need a cross-section of the community, a genuine cross-section of the community. I name them because it's amazing when you ask people about community, they think of neighbourhoods. That's not community. That's part of community. Where you work, and I don't mean us, because many of us are in the health services. I mean the factories. I mean the companies with over 200 employees, over 50 employees. I mean the schools, the primary schools, the creches, the art galleries, the museums, the shops in the high street, the rugby league clubs, soccer clubs. I get confused. I kept moving around countries. I can't remember what you call football in every country I move to. Tennis clubs, golf clubs. End-of-life care in all of those places. Why? Because people die in those places. And they grieve in those places. And they're caregiving in those places. That's why. So what is public health? Okay, so here it is. Here it is. If you take any notes, this is the one to do it. A Master of Public Health degree will cost you 9,000 quid. In the UK, I could save you 9,000 quid if you just take this down now. Everything you ever wanted to know is here. Anyone who tells you different is trying to sell you maybe an MPH. So, we know what prevention is, don't we? A good example of prevention, condom. It stops the bad thing from happening at all. Then there's harm reduction. Doesn't always stop the bad things, but when the bad things happen, they do less damage. What's an example of that? Seatbelt. Remember before the seatbelt? Now, when you wear seatbelts now, you just end up with maybe losing your spleen. But in the old days, you used to lose your head. You'd go flying through the windscreen, be decapitated. Remember those good old days? And it was always awful losing your head. Terrible at parties. No one would stand near you. You couldn't talk to people. You always had a sore throat. Thanks to harm reduction now, you just lose your spleen, assuming you survive it all. Health and death education, very important. When you go into the supermarket, you don't even think about it now. And you check out all the different breakfast cereals. You look at it on the packet there and you see how much sugar in there for your children. You see that many of the cereals have got 98% sugar. You're not going to buy that. You know better than that. You'll buy the healthy one, right? The one with 80% sugar. Participatory relations. There is no point in working on communities any more than there is working on patients. You need to work with communities, work alongside them, work with their partners. They have things to teach you. We have things to teach them. There's no point going to Bangladesh and handing condoms out to the sex workers. Pointless. And that's because the gender relations between women, sex workers, and their men is a very tricky business. So you need to develop a condom strategy with the sex workers, because they know what gets a man to put a condom on in a patriarchal society, not your health worker. So it's a good partnership. And we need to do the same. We need not to give death education to people like we're bombing Germany in the Second World War. We need to sit with people and learn what their experiences of death and loss are. Learn from that. Trade, exchange our experiences, learn from each other. That's the kind of death education we need. And that is about community development, working with the businesses and the schools together. Most businesses and schools don't have a policy on death and loss. And that's the case even in England today. We ring up quite a few schools and they don't. But many do once you start explaining to them the value of having a policy. And the palliative care service can move in and with them gather a group of parents and students and teachers and say, in the last couple of years, what deaths and serious illness have we had? What did we do well? What did we do poorly? And develop a living document gathered around themselves, their own experience, and allow them to act more appropriately and better, more supportive in the future. That's community development, working with, not on people. And then there's service partnerships. Palliative care is still very much working in a silo. It's not alone that way. But we do need friends in aged care. God only knows we need friends in public health. And there are special public health areas. I would like to see Andy mobbed at the end of this talk. But they're not the only groups we should be working with. The great bereavement counsellors in any community are the veterinary clinics. They have a huge capacity, caseload of bereaved people. See, it's not the face that matters. It can be furry and it can be just skin, but it's the relationship. It's the relationship that matters. And the emergency services. We think in palliative care we deal with a lot of death and dying. Spend a day with a cop or an ambo. Those are our colleagues and the funeral industry. I remember working with a palliative care service in Australia where they had no relationship with the funeral industry. The car would back up to the hospice and take the body and there'd be no handover. They'd just have a name. The funeral company would have to learn all over again about the man or woman they just carried off. They'd have to probably learn it from the family. Crazy stuff. Service partnerships are absolutely crucial. We need to break out of our own home and make new friends. And finally, there's an ecological and settings emphasis. This is one of the more tricky ones to explain. So I always use the one story, which goes further back than when I was Professor of Palliative Care, but I'll tell it here again, it doesn't take too long. Before I was Professor of Palliative Care in Australia, I was briefly a Professor in Drug and Alcohol Studies. It's a very long story. If you buy me a vodka, I'll tell you about it later. It was only a small couple of years I did it. And I worked for a Quango, a quasi-autonomous non-government association in the city of Melbourne with a population of 3.5 million at the time. I had a research staff, I was head of research, and I had a research staff of 30. We had 70 clinicians and 30 education and training people. So we were an organisation of about 130. 50 kilometres down the road, there was a working class city called Geelong. There were only 3 employers in the city of Geelong: the Ford Motor Car Company, Pioneer Concrete, and the Shell Oil Refinery. And every Friday and Saturday night, there was a distinguished tradition in that city where the workers would descend upon the city and destroy it. The wealthiest people in Geelong were the window replacement firms. And after about 20 years, the people in Geelong had had enough of this. And so I was visited by the representatives of the Chamber of Commerce, the Department of Health, Emergency Services, and a number of other key organisations within the city. There were about 7 or 8 people who came to my office. They had tried everything. They did the American thing, zero tolerance. They arrested everybody, and they got the American result: overcrowded prisoners with nowhere else to put the future drunks. Then they tried the Russian experience where they had forced education camps. So if you were caught drunk and disorderly, you were forced to undergo a week's training in antisocial behaviour. That also got the Russian result. People drank more. So finally they decided to come to Turning Point Drug and Alcohol Centre, it's funded by the government anyway, and said, can you help us? And we said, well, I said, yes, we can do this. And those of you who work in drug and alcohol, this will be no surprise to you. This is not rocket science. I said, look, we can help you, but if we help you, you're going to have to do everything we say for 6 months or we won't be in it. So they said, yes. And I said, no, you drive home to Geelong, you phone me when you get there, you think about what this means. So they drove home and they rang me and said, we'll do everything. So fine. So I sent half a dozen of my best researchers every Friday and Saturday night to Geelong City. And I say my best researchers, these were not data analysis people, methodologically skilled people. They were the people who, when you walk into work in the morning, they can see your socks are mismatched. They were really observant people. And I sent those 6 people down Friday and Saturday night, and they made observations over a period of 4 weeks. When we were finished, we developed 27 interventions. Now, I won't go through the 27 interventions, but we banned happy hour. We forced all the venues to put some food on the bars. We gave the police a healthcare role. They were not to arrest anyone unless there was a threat to life. They were to drive them home. Taxi service. We changed the music in all the venues. So all of the venues were required to play one quiet piece followed by 2 headbanging pieces. So all the music went 1 quiet, 2 headbanging, 1 quiet, 2 headbanging. You got that? We gave them a choice. You could remove all the tables and chairs from your venue, or you could bolt them to the floor. Happily, for research purposes, half went with bolting and half went with removal. For those of you unfamiliar with alcohol use, what happens with a lot of alcohol is that drunks tend to have an estranged fashion sense, and they like to use tables and chairs as head ornaments, not on themselves, but to other people. So that was the reason for that one. And several others. After 6 months, we had a drop of over 50% in damage to public property and personal injury. You could have shot a cannon through accident and emergency and you would have only hit a few teenagers who'd eaten Kentucky Fried Chicken and poisoned themselves. So this was not community development. This was a top-down settings approach where we manipulate the physical and social environment to get the desired outcomes. Now, the final feature of any public health approach is sustainability. Little pet projects that you do, that if it requires you to keep doing them, these are not public health approach. These are novelty projects. Public health projects are projects that are owned by the community, and they run and they run and they run. What you supply is leadership and facilitation. Okay, so that's Public Health 101. So we've developed public health approach in palliative care services right across Britain at the moment, and then even Northern Ireland has started some. In Derry, have committed themselves to being a compassionate city. Limerick, as many of you will know, is a major beacon of public health approach and palliative care in the Republic. And we have major programs running across the continent and in Canada and Australia and in Asia. Well, some of the things we're doing is a poster campaign. There are many different examples, but a poster campaign. I'll give you an example of a poster campaign. When I was living and working in Melbourne City in Australia, I would go to the international airport, I would go to the toilets, I would close the cubicle, and on the back of the cubicle was a poster for condom use. Now, that poster had been put there by my HIV/AIDS colleagues. Now, what's remarkable about that? What's remarkable about that is that at the time I saw that poster, the number of people who died of AIDS in my country was between 40 and 50 a year. 40 and 50 a year. And yet I could not go almost anywhere in Australia without escaping from a condom ad. The number of people who are bereaved in any one year in my state of Victoria would fill the Australian Tennis Centre, and then there would be a queue, and the Australian Tennis Centre is 80,000 seats, and there would be a queue to Geelong. There's not one goddamn poster. Not one poster. What have my palliative care colleagues been doing that they have not given me one piece of education that would allow me to understand that listening is better than talking when supporting a friend? How hard is this? Their attentions have been elsewhere. Positive grieving, art exhibitions, death cafes. I'm sure you've heard of death cafes. Annual emergency services roundtable where the emergency services sit with people in aged care and palliative care and exchange stories about their work. That's called support. They're not getting counselling, but they're getting a day where they work with each other and support each other in their own experiences of loss and death and trauma. And a very important thing that we do. Roundtables are very important support services. Public forums on death and loss. The Scottish Partnership for Palliative Care are very good at these kinds of things. Public forums on death and loss where they encourage people to speak and debate and discuss issues around death, dying and loss. We have the adoption of the Compassionate City Charter, and I'll talk about that later. Annual short story competition, annual Peacetime Remembrance Day. You know, one of the interesting things that we have a Veterans Day once a year celebrating and remembering the dead in war. But the reality is the overwhelming majority of people who die every year die in peacetime, not in war. Yet we don't march the streets and remember our fathers and our mothers and our sons and our daughters and our dogs and our horses and cats, our grandparents, our babies, our stillborn. It's outrageous. And there are befriending programs. Shropshire started with 4 compassionate communities, now has 20. It's shown up to 50% reduction in emergency service use and primary care use since the introduction of befriending programs. Frome in Somerset have done the same, using a Compassionate City Charter and a befriending program and a social prescribing program, and they've had a reduction of 30% in primary care use and hospital use and emergency services use, representing a 10% saving for the local NHS. These are programs that work. Then there's the Compassionate City Charter. You can see the Compassionate City Charter on the Public Health Palliative Care International website, or you can go to the NCPC, National Council for Palliative Care website. The charter is in the Public Health Toolkit there, if you're interested. It's a 12-point action charter that says that workplaces and schools have to develop policies for those in their care, that church groups have to lead befriending schemes, that hospices and nursing homes must have community development programs. There's nothing wrong with institutions. The problem with institutions is what institution do they model themselves on? Does the care home model itself on a prison, or a university, or a hospital, or a public library? That's really the question here. Institutions are important. We'll not get rid of them. Hospitals and hospices and care homes are here to stay, and they can be good places, and hospices have actually shown that. But it's what role model they aspire to, which is the real question here. And community development programs run out of hospices, and care homes make their walls permeable. There was a major care home in Europe that introduced a bar, public bar, so people would come there for a drink after work, and the residents and the staff would pull the beers. They weren't really there to visit the old people, but the old people would sit there with them and clean up the glasses. Those that were ambulant, those who were in wheelchairs would still pull the beer. And life expectancy was 8 months before that started, and it became 18 months after the bar was introduced. Power of beer. No, I think it was the social support. Museums and art galleries have to have annual exhibitions on death, dying, caregiving and loss. There has to be peacetime memorial parades, what we call a March of Memories, because we'll be having one in Bradford. There'll be local government incentives and award schemes to encourage compassionate workplaces, compassionate schools, short story and art competitions, end-of-life care support schemes for the homeless and those in prison. Short story and art competitions. Why is that important? I grew up in the Japanese and Chinese communities in Australia. I know I don't look it, but I did. And I used to sit there often with the children like myself who were either mixed race or Australian born, and we used to watch TV together, about 8 or 9 of us from very different families. We did this for years in Australia in the 60s. And we used to watch the TV, and we used to discuss among ourselves, how come our faces, not mine in this case, but my friends' faces, and their families' faces, and my family's faces, why they weren't on the TV? Why are they all just whiteys? So we developed a theory, actually 2 theories. The first theory was maybe Australians didn't consider us Australians. The second theory, favoured by about half the group, was worse. And that theory was maybe they did consider us Australians, but they just didn't like us. So what does somebody with a life-limiting illness see when they watch TV? What does a bereaved person see when they watch TV? Somebody who's lost their dog or their cat who can't talk about it. What do they see when they watch TV? Not themselves. So if they're not there, what is the TV telling them about their experience? The short story competitions and art gallery expositions, they get into the fine crevices of a society and a community, and they open them up. And they reflect back on people's diverse experiences. So we've been doing the public health approach now nearly 20 years, and it's spreading pretty rapidly. I'm very happy to say things are not like they were when I first came in 1996 in Australia and 2006 in the UK. Things have brightened up quite a bit. We now, from the evaluations that we have, and it's early days, we see a greater participation from all sectors of the community, a decrease in unscheduled service use and 24-hour crisis lines. We see an active increase in partnerships, greater recognition and connection between groups that never thought they had anything in common. New local policy developments is what you would expect, particularly of those who adopt the Charter, but not just those. Compassionate communities are far older than compassionate cities, and many compassionate communities have infiltrated schools and workplaces and worked very hard to bring the community with them as a whole. They're not just befriending schemes. There has been a greater sense of normalisation around death, dying, loss and caregiving. There's been an increase in community involvement, and there have been government changes in Australia and in Scotland and in Canada. Actually, just recently I've heard some provincial governments have changed their legislation and their policies around palliative care to require them to have a public health component to their end-of-life care service provision. There are major practice experiments now in Austria, Canada, England, Germany, Ireland, India, Spain and Switzerland. The Public Health Palliative Care International have members from all over the world, and I actually can't always keep up with it. I mean, I do go to the board meetings, but I think there's been a lot of developments in Africa recently, for example, and the Middle East. There's been a sharp international rise in academic and clinical papers and books on this approach, and a gradual evidence accumulation. And there's now an international conference series, which I think is in its 5th incarnation. So the first conference was in India, the second in Bangladesh, the third in the Republic of Ireland, hosted by Milford Care Centre, the 4th in Bristol in England, and the 5th will be in Ottawa in Canada. We always get about 200 people attending. It's quite a small conference, but it's growing all the time. I believe the Americans, they're always sleepy on anything that remotely looks social. I think they think it's communism. But eventually they seem to be coming around, and there's a lot of interest by the Americans to come to Canada. But that could be a Trump effect, so it's very hard to say. I don't know. Many of them may be planning defection. So. Okay. So, what are the overlooked facts of palliative care that make this important? First of all, there's the 95% rule. When you think about dying people, you often think about somebody reclining in a bed in a hospital or a nursing home or a hospice. That's not what dying's about. That's late dying. Even those of us in the clinical world know that's late dying. Dying is the realization you're going to die soon. And it's an identity issue. It's not a physical issue. And you can be dying for some years. And there's a lot of people who are not actually dying, but might be dying. The very old, for example. The people with 3 or more long-term health conditions, 3 or more life-limiting conditions. You go into a care home and people are dying of all sorts of things, and that's just one person. They may have dementia, they have a cardiac failure, they may have a cancer, all sorts of things. The cause of death will not tell you, like it used to do 30, 40 years ago. The cause of death does not tell you the course of the dying. Just because you died of cancer does not tell you what the last 12 months was like, because the last 12 months may have been characterized by COPD and dementia, not the cancer which eventually killed you. Dying is not death anymore. And no matter how many professionals you throw at someone who's dying, 95% of the time that a dying person spends, they spend outside episodes of care. Outside episodes of care. 95%. That 95%, they're either alone, or with family, or with friends, or their animal companions, or the television set. Now, I know that if you read the clinical literature, it's full of problems. But actually, you know what? Dying is mainly not full of problems, nor is bereavement. The first study I did was in the 80s. I interviewed 100 people with less than 6 months to live in a regional oncology unit. And people often say to me, "What did you find out? What did you find out?" Well, the most interesting thing I found, actually there were a lot of different interesting things, but one of the key findings was that people watch more TV than they ever have before. Now you try getting that in the Lancet. They don't want to know. They can't do anything about that. They want problems. If you've got problems, send them to the Lancet. They'll publish them. Now that basically means that our clinical literature is biased. And it's biased because it's full of problems, and then you generated a generation of professionals to think, right, we can fix the problems. But actually, there's a whole other world out there which is not about problems. So what are we doing in that 95%? Ask yourself this. Don't try to put a district nurse or a palliative medicine consultant on every street corner. Ask yourself, if you really care about dying in bereavement, where 95% of it is outside your possible reach, what is it you're going to do? Or are you just going to wait there till that 5% rolls up and then you're available? Is that the game? And also palliative care is about grief and loss. I don't know how many times I hear about palliative care and the patient. Even if you read Cicely Saunders, she never said this. Palliative care is care of the dying and the family. And for the family, it's caregiving and grief and loss. In Australia, the palliative care services, their idea of supporting grief and loss was one of three things. They would offer you counselling. That goes without saying. They'd offer a door-to-door salesman counselling if they turned up. But you get the counselling if you're bereaved. They would send you a card 12 months after the death, and they were offered to hold a memorial service for you as well. Now, I don't know about you, and I don't know what your experiences of grief and loss are, but I'm underwhelmed by that. I know the heart's in the right place, but that's not even a good palliative care service if you're taking grief and loss seriously. You really need to do better. And you can't do better unless you have the community as your partner. It's never going to happen. Because you'll never get the continuity of care and you'll never get the quality of care unless you can enlist the family and friends and workmates and people at church and at the club. You'll not do the job. Dying, loss and grief are not medical matters. Dying and bereavement is not like an ingrown toenail. It's mainly a psychological, spiritual and social matter. And the key is the social. We already know the cure for bereavement, don't we? Don't we? The cure for bereavement, think about that for a moment. The cure for bereavement is bring back the dead. You bring back the person who's died, everybody's right. And that tells you that what we're talking about here is a social relationship. And the psychological and emotional are the backwash of the loss. That's pretty elementary. But it might also mean that if the problem is social, the solution might be social. So what are our social strategies for supporting grief and loss? Better not just be counselling. And then there's the business about invisible groups. Invisible groups are subject to surprise, ignorance and fear, and they can be disenfranchised. And that's why it's important to have public engagement around death and loss. So we need to recognise the limits to service provision. Yes, we have to have our hospices. Yes, we need the doctors and the nurses. Nothing I have said is negating the service system, but it's not enough. You have to understand there's a limit to what we can do, but we can do much more if we think outside the service system box and embrace a public health approach. We need to restore end-of-life care to the wider public health sphere, get with the program, and understand and facilitate the principle that end-of-life care is everyone's responsibility. We've got to stop this business of thinking that this is just up to the nurses and the doctors and the social workers and the chaplains. It's not. We all have a role to play, and we have to attract our public health colleagues into this. We still have a situation where public health colleagues think they're about obesity and anti-smoking. It's got to stop. We have to be able to have conversations with them and introduce them to the real comorbidities of living with a life-limiting illness and living with caregiving and living with loss. We need to get the skills that public health people have, the health promotion skills, the community engagement skills, community development skills, the public education skills, and marry them with our skills and experience in death, dying, loss, and bereavement. And that would be a perfect marriage. So we have to move from the idea of thinking about patients all the time and thinking about citizenship, moving from health services to social capital, thinking about supporting the workplaces and schools, moving from family to community. The only reason why we mention family is because very few people are alone. They have families. So why stop there? Keep going. Very few families don't have communities, so communities need to be brought into this equation. And we have to move from palliative care holism, throwing a professional at every need we identify and start thinking about public health holism, the bar, the street, the neighbourhood, the school playground, the book, the Kindle, the social media, the public park, the golf course, the tennis court. That's the holism we have to start thinking about. And we have to think about community capacity building. That means death education for all, community development initiatives, community and service partnerships, empowerment of volunteers. You know, I always say to hospices, I'm going to finish in 1 minute, but I'm going to squeeze this one in. Life would be great in hospices if we turned it upside down. We made the trustees the volunteers, and we made the volunteers the trustees, and then we get it right. We send our trustees who are volunteers back where they came from, back to the businesses and the churches, and say, give us the changes where you come from. And we have the volunteers to say, remember the power of the neighbourhood and the community in supporting end-of-life care. And then we've got the formula right. And we have to move, not reject, we have to move from bedside to a public health. We have to learn to be able to do both. The bedside care is important. The hospice care is important. Although the bulk of people will not die in hospices, and the bulk of the people who do die in hospices will only do it in the last few days and weeks of their lives, yet 1 in 5 households in Europe and in Britain are sole person households. They have no supports. And hospices and care homes will play an important role. So those things are important. But the action, my friends, is outside those organisations. And we need to embrace the civic sector into end-of-life care. We need to create compassionate cities wherever we can. It's now a social movement. The more the merrier. And we always need to remember that at the end of the day, we need to practice leadership, not control. And with leadership, we have the time and the resources to provide social change to the rest of the community and ourselves. And I end with a bit of self-promotion. Thank you very much.